appeared in the Alberta legislature. My name is David Carter, Speaker of the House and MLA for Calgary-Egmont. Today in the galleries we have special guests. We have the ambassador from Yugoslavia, and also in the gallery we have special guests from Australia, in the person of Speaker Lynn Powell of the Queensland State Legislature, together with his wife and his deputy clerk. After the House gets past question period, the government will be moving to second readings of bills. At the moment we have 22 bills at this particular stage of development, or lack of development. This evening the House reconvenes at 8 o'clock and will probably work through to at least 11 o'clock dealing with second readings of various bills. Let us pray. O Lord, grant us a daily awareness of the precious gift of life which you have given us. As members of this legislative assembly, we dedicate our lives anew to the service of our province and our country. Amen.
Introduction of visitors.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased today to introduce to you and through you to members of the Assembly a distinguished visitor seated in your gallery. Mr. Speaker, our visitor today is Dr. Vladimir Pavasevich, who is the ambassador to Canada from Yugoslavia. Mr. Speaker, we had an excellent visit today and discussions over lunch, and an enthusiastic representative of his country to ours, and we look forward to continued good relations between Canada and Yugoslavia. And I'd ask that members warmly welcome our guest today.
Colleagues, it's my pleasure to introduce to you a fellow speaker from Australia, Speaker Lynn Powell of the Queensland State Legislature. He is accompanied by his wife Jan and by his deputy clerk, Mr. Robert Doyle. And they're seated in my gallery, and I'd ask them to rise and be recognized by the House. And on this day, I would also like to remind members of the House that those of you who came into the House for the first time in the 1986 election are celebrating your second anniversary.
Presenting petitions. Reading and receiving petitions. Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Notices of motions. Introduction of bills.
Member for Calgary-McCall, followed by Calgary-Glenmore, then Ponoka-Rimby.
Mr. Speaker, I request leave to introduce a bill, PR 17, St. Vladimir's Ukrainian Orthodox Congregation at Calgary Tax Exemption Act. The purpose of this bill is to provide for a tax exemption for a community organization.
Honourable member for Calgary-McCall has moved first reading to Bill PR 17, St. Vladimir's Ukrainian Orthodox Congregation at Calgary Tax Exemption Act. Those in favor of first reading, please say aye. Opposed, please say no. So ordered.
Bill number PR 17, St. Vladimir's Ukrainian Orthodox Congregation at Calgary Tax Exemption Act, introduced by the Honourable Member Mr. Nelson, is now read a first time.
Calgary Glenmore.
Mr. Speaker, I request leave to introduce Bill PR 19, Calgary Municipal Heritage Properties Authority Amendment Act 1988. The purpose of this bill is to establish the non-profit nature of the authority. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Calgary Glenmore has moved first reading of Bill PR 19, Calgary Municipal Heritage Properties Authority Amendment Act 1988. Those in favor of first reading, please say aye. Opposed, please say no. Carried.
Bill number PR 19, Calgary Municipal Heritage Properties Authority Amendment Act 1988, introduced by the Honourable Member Mrs. Myrosh, is now read a first time.
Panoka Rimby.
Mr. Speaker, I request leave to introduce Bill PR 20, the Maskwacis Cultural College Act. Mr. Speaker, the purpose of this bill is to provide for the constitution and powers of the college.
The Honourable Member for Panoka Rimby has moved first reading of Bill PR 20, Maskwacis Cultural College Act. Those in favor of first reading, please say aye. Opposed, please say no. Carried.
Bill number PR 20, Maskwacis Cultural College Act, introduced by the Honourable Member Mr. Johnson, is now read a first time. Tabling returns and reports.
Member for Edmonton Glengarry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to table information gained through the Legislature Library which indicates that at least 2 countries in the Western world had environment departments prior to Alberta and corrects information sent by the government to 1.5 million homes in the province.
Introduction of special guests.
Mr. Speaker, it's nice today to be able to introduce a group of school students from the Sweetgrass Elementary School, grade 6. There's some 55 students who are in the members gallery. They're accompanied by teachers Ms. McLean, Ms. Foreman, Ms. Smith, and a parent, Mrs. Wright. I'd ask them to stand, please, and receive the welcome of the legislature.
Member for Highwood.
Mr. Speaker, we have within our midst today a former municipal politician in the person of Tom Harvey, who at one time was the mayor of County Borough of St. Helens, a town within earshot of Liverpool, England. He is the uncle of my secretary, Kelly King, and I would ask them to rise and accept the welcome of the ladies and gentlemen of the legislature.
Member for Vegreville.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure for me to introduce to you and to members of the Assembly today 52 grade 6 students from the Peter Savard School in the town of Vegreville. They're seated in the public gallery and accompanied by 3 teachers, Mr. Raymond Sharuk, Mrs. Lil Homanyuk, and Mr. Randy Foots. And if I might ask members to give them a warm welcome when they stand to be recognized in that gallery.
Just a minute, David. Just a minute.
Oral question period.
Speaker, to the Premier. Mr. Speaker, despite the posturing last week about caring for the average family, there are many serious, and I say serious economic issues facing families, Mr. Speaker, and if I may say so, they have not been addressed by this government. Mr. Speaker, we're hoping sincerely that the Premier's desire to make political gains through expressions of support for families will actually be translated into actual policies which benefit average families. Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, when we raised the issue of parental leave and the treatment of single mothers by social services, we were disappointed by lack of response. But, Mr. Speaker, hope springs eternal. My question is to the Premier. Will he advise whether he is considering helping families cope by reviewing the myriad of taxes paid by all 3 levels of government on an average family in Alberta today?
Well, Mr. Speaker, obviously taxation is a matter that's reviewed constantly by the provincial government, and I suppose all other levels of government as well. In the course of attempting to work our way through, as I described to the House last week, the complex nature of families and the complex nature of families these days, and the complexity in trying to support families, which we're determined to do, we will consider all options.
Well, Mr. Speaker, rhetoric is cheap. I think people are looking for some dollars and cents from the taxation system. But, Mr. Speaker, the Premier last week noted, and a correct one if I may say so, an imbalance in the benefits available to families who use daycare compared with those who care for their own children at home. Mr. Speaker, the Premier's raised this matter himself. My question, a specific question, is he prepared then, as the Premier of the province, to recommend much greater family deductions, or better yet, a tax credit to offset this imbalance?
As I said, Mr. Speaker, all options will be considered. And also to point out to the House, Mr. Speaker, Alberta has the lowest taxation in Canada.
Mr. Speaker, that means nothing. That rhetoric means nothing to average people, Mr. Speaker. And you're not including things like Medicare premium of user fees, Mr. Speaker. I'm trying to be specific to the Premier. Mr. Speaker, if I may then, to give him a specific example, is that many working families, especially if I may say so in the inner city, are renters of low and modest income. And last year the Premier is aware that the provincial government, we believe unfairly, withdrew the renters tax credit. Now, Mr. Speaker, my question to the Premier, if the Premier is so concerned about families, especially those of modest incomes, why did they move in this regressive way to remove this tax credit?
Mr. Speaker, obviously when a program is put in, when rents are high and vacancy rates very, very low, then it's needed. But when rates are very low and vacancy rates are very, very high, obviously you don't continue the program that was put in for other conditions. And to follow through on the matter of taxation, obviously the more programs you carry that are not needed, the higher taxation it will be on all Albertans. So, Mr. Speaker, I think it follows that move was certainly a logical one.
Well, Mr. Speaker.
They're happy about this?
Here's the Premier, that caring person for the family, Mr. Speaker, and we're talking about a specific program.
Right.
And it was unfair, Mr. Speaker. It gave some equity between renters of modest income and property owner rebate. My question to the Premier is simply this, Mr. Speaker: is the Premier now prepared to recognize the harm that this has done, and it has done it in inner cities, Mr. Speaker, and will he move now to reinstate that tax credit?
It's interesting, Mr. Speaker, how the socialists are trying to get on to the side of the family now, having blown it so badly last week. But, Mr. Speaker, I will just say, as I said earlier, that we will consider all options.
Supplementary, Westlock Sturgeon.
Mr. Speaker, to the Treasurer, and I'm sorry, but to the Premier, I'm sorry, I'm jumping around here. Would the Premier consider, in view of the fact that is often said, when you educate a man, you educate one person, but when you educate a mother, you educate a whole family. Therefore, is the Premier considering opening up and increasing the grants that are available to single mothers who wish to go back to school and then improve their standard of living or their ability to earn money?
Well, Mr. Speaker, in the full context of the various training programs and career development opportunities that the government provides, I'll certainly look at that representation from the member.
The second main question, Leader of the Opposition.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to designate my second question, the member from Vegreville.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Premier. The number of people who are concerned with and opposed to the federal government's plans to close a number of post offices in rural areas is growing, and certainly the caravan initiated by Rural Dignity that across the country highlighted that concern and drew a lot of attention to this important matter. Now, the government repeatedly refuses to acknowledge its responsibility to represent Albertans on this important issue by passing it off as a federal issue. And I'd like to ask the Premier, in light of the fact that the Saskatchewan legislature on May 18th, in its wisdom, gave unanimous consent to a motion opposing the federal government's plans to close and privatize rural post offices, I'd like to ask the Premier if he would agree to giving unanimous consent to a similar motion in this Assembly so that we can present a united Western Front on this important issue.
Mr. Speaker, one member certainly can't give unanimous consent.
That's a curious answer from someone who purports to be the leader of government, Mr. Speaker, but I would like to...
Well, let's get into the supplementary.
To ask the Premier, in view of the fact that this issue was not discussed apparently or commented on at the recent Western Premiers Conference in BC, and in view of the fact that they did discuss a number of other federal issues of concern, I'd like the Premier to explain, does this indicate the kind of priority that he assigns to the closure of post offices in rural Alberta?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member should know that there were many things discussed amongst the Western Premiers that didn't find their way into either print or into communiques.
Did that? You would agree.
Well, it's fortunate that at least one Conservative provincial government has the guts to stand up and say no way to Mulrooney when he plans to close post offices. But recent information has come to light, Mr. Speaker, that the federal government is indeed planning to privatize all 5,200 post offices in rural areas, and I'd like to ask the Premier if his government has had a chance to assess those plans, and if they have, do they support them?
Mr. Speaker, as the honourable member says, recently it has come to light. This is a federal matter. The government has not been investigating.
Do I take it to mean then that the Premier is going to stand by, not study the issue, not make representation to Ottawa, and just allow his cousins in Ottawa to go ahead and close and privatize post offices, regardless of the impact on rural families?
Organizing the question here in Ottawa.
No, that's not our intent, Mr. Speaker.
Stadler, briefly.
Mr. Speaker, a supplementary question. Considering the fact that possible privatization of a rural post office could contribute not only to the health of the community or the continuing health of the community, but also to the better health of local small businesses, will the Premier confirm that in looking at this program that privatization is not a bad option in comparison with closing the post office?
I think, Mr. Speaker, the honourable member makes a good point. Obviously, there's a variety of ways of delivering services. We've had problems with the Postal Service in its present form. Perhaps with some innovative thinking, we can provide this very valuable service in other ways.
Once again, the Chair has to remind the House the difficulty with declining the questioning about the post office. It's clearly the responsibility of the federal government under the Constitution Act of 1867, Section 91, subsection 5. Westlock Sturgeon, main question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On April the 20th of this year, Mr. Speaker, I asked the Minister of Municipal Affairs and the Attorney General whether they were aware that 8 U.S. states had initiated legal action in March, Mr. Speaker, against a cartel of insurance companies, many of whom operate here in Alberta. As has been, Mr. Speaker, increasingly common, this government knew nothing about it. However, they made very valiant promises to fill me in down the road. Now, my question to the Attorney General, have you, after this length of time, been able to review whether or not you're ready to your department is ready to take action against the insurance companies in this province for very obviously high and exorbitant rates?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Leader of the Liberal Party has contained in his question some very serious allegations which are, to our knowledge, are not substantiated. What I did undertake to do, and will be undertaken, is at the forthcoming meeting of the Attorneys General of the United States, where I had hoped to attend, but in view of the length of the session, it appears that I will not attend personally, have the official who attends on my behalf review the actions which have been taken by various states and report back after I've been informed.
Mr. Speaker, my apologies for denying you your chance to kick up your heels down south there. Mr. Speaker, again to the Attorney General then, this was an action in concert with other Attorney Generals of the states. There was a meeting of Attorneys General, Canadian Attorneys Generals in May. Did the minister take it up with them to see whether there could be some common action, as there was done in the U.S., to look into the whole question of fixing of liability insurance?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Leader of the Liberal Party is not preventing me from doing anything that I should do. My duties here, of course, take precedence over the particular meeting in question. Well, it was part of the Honourable Member's preamble, so I think perhaps I could respond to it, Mr. Speaker. At the meeting of the Ministers of Justice, the issue was not an agenda item. It may very well be under discussion at the Ministers of Consumer and Corporate Affairs meetings, but this matter will be reviewed in the Alberta context, and it has not been customary in Canada for provinces to join together in actions, joint actions. If actions are warranted, they will be undertaken by individual provinces after a review of the facts that take place within the individual province. So far as I'm aware, the matter has not been discussed at the meetings of Ministers of Consumer and Corporate Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, then button, who's got the button? Then to the Minister of Consumer and Corporate Affairs, who I understand is probably is supposed to be in charge, Mr. Speaker, of Superintendent of Insurance. In view of the fact that the acting minister back in March or April promised me that they would look into it, has the minister had a chance, I know she's been busy, to ask the Superintendent of Insurance to look into the whole question of price fixing of liability insurance to municipalities and hospitals?
Mr. Speaker, I noted with fond memory that the day the honourable member raised the question was April 20th, which was the day after my wedding, so I must thank him for recalling to me that wonderful event. We had our Consumer and Corporate Affairs annual meeting among ministers from across Canada and the territories in February this year, and the matter was not raised at that time among us. It was subsequent, of course, that it did occur. My department is monitoring the situation, but I would point out to the honourable member that we are talking about an anti-competition act. And the anti-competition rules in this country are, of course, federal, again, by the very act that you mentioned earlier, Mr. Speaker. I can advise for information that the Competition Tribunal in Ottawa is monitoring the situation in the United States very closely to see what the outcome of that particular lawsuit will be.
Mr. Speaker, to misquote the Premier, the best place for a woman is in the House, so thank you. Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry I shot over your head there. Mr. Speaker, this is back to the Minister then of Health. The Minister of Health done anything to add his voice to the municipalities and to the others that are, and the hospital boards that are so concerned at nearly a 25% increase in liability insurance? Surely he could put some weight on getting this thing solved instead of just bouncing around. Has he?
Thank you, Honourable Member. That's enough. Thank you. Thank you, Honourable Member. This is a supplementary. Thank you. Fine. Mr. Minister?
Perhaps the honourable member could finish asking his question. I did not hear it. I heard all the preambles.
Mr. Speaker, I tried to, but you had a duet going there for a while. May I ask you then, have you put any heat on the Consumer and Corporate Affairs and the Superintendent of Insurance to investigate why this huge jump in liability insurance for hospital boards over the last couple of years?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member must have been missing from the legislature for several months or perhaps as long as a year. We changed the system with respect to liability insurance coverage for hospitals 2 years ago, and by way of agreeing to a self-insurance program operated by the Alberta Hospital Association.
Thank you. The member for Clover Bar on behalf of the representative party, followed by Stetler.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of the Environment. Last week there was a flare-off at the petrochemical plant in the eastern part of the city, which borders on my constituents and the honourable member from Sherwood Park. And last night, Mr. Speaker, there was a power failure again, and there was a large flare-off. Can the Minister indicate what has happened between the time we had the first flare-off and last night to find out if this petrochemical refinery is going to be able to control the emissions from those stacks in an emergency situation?
Mr. Speaker, the two events are unrelated. The first event that the honourable member refers to is one that took place on June 2nd, 1988, when TransAlta Utility was doing some work in two of the maintenance power plants that they have. There are basically three main power feeds that go into the Petro-Canada refinery. And as a result of an error by TransAlta Utilities, it seems that in essence was a whole shutdown caused by the petrochemical plant. That necessitated, the power out, that necessitated a flow through of certain products in all of the piping within the Petro-Canada plant to avert fire explosion and the like. That matter is under investigation right now and has been under investigation in consort with Petro-Canada and TransAlta Utilities and Alberta Environment people. The event that occurred, the second event that the honourable member referred to is one that occurred on June 12th at about 8:30 in the morning, and it lasted for approximately 5 minutes, and it related to a trip in the power blower system.
Mr. Speaker, can the Minister indicate what steps the department is taking to ensure that this facility will have adequate emergency power so that this doesn't happen as frequently as it has happened?
That's part of the review of the whole operation of the petrochemical plant, Mr. Speaker, and that matter remains under review, and when the review is concluded, I'll be very happy to make that information available to all members of the Assembly and to the public.
Mr. Speaker, what steps has the Minister or the Department taken to assure the people in the affected area that there is or is not any danger to their health?
Mr. Speaker, we have a reporting system that is in place, and in case of both events, they were simply hydrocarbon releases. There was no impact of any contaminant that was released into the environment, and a statement was made within a few minutes of the release on both occasions, alerting the media and in essence asking their cooperation to alert the citizenry at large that there was really nothing to be disturbed about other than a very dirty looking black cloud.
Mr. Speaker, a final supplementary. Can the Minister indicate if the Department or the Minister has looked at alternatives other than a burn-off to diffuse a potentially dangerous situation?
Mr. Speaker, I had indicated really in the response to the second question that that's part of the investigation that's ongoing. In essence, if there is a solution, another alternative, that's one that I would want officials, not only in Alberta Environment, but in other departments of government to bring to my knowledge and to my attention to basically see whether or not there is need for these alternative backup systems to be in place. The reality is that in essence what was released was hydrocarbons, basically harmless, but they have a very negative impact visually in looking at a black cloud emanating.
Member for Westlock Sturgeon.
In spite of the Minister of Environment's statement that hydrocarbon is not dangerous, it is. Could the Minister ask his people to check in both California and in Wales and west of England for the system they use of total power substitution if the main power goes off, so that there's no necessity to dump this stuff into the air?
Mr. Speaker, the response to the question is yes. We'll certainly ascertain ourselves with that information that may be available in other jurisdictions in the world. There is a question, though, in terms of the one event that occurred on June the 2nd, that from a safety perspective and a safety point of view, there was no other alternative but to, in essence, have that burn off. And it was from a safety perspective that it was permitted and it was undertaken.
To member for Stettler, followed by supplementary Edmonton Beverly.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Community and Occupational Health. On May 15th of this year, a fatality occurred at that particular plant as well. Could the Minister tell us as to how the investigation is progressing on this particular fatality and what's his involvement in it?
Mr. Speaker, the investigation is ongoing, and my involvement is one that will begin once I have the results of that investigation, which I expect sometime by midsummer.
Thank you. Stettler, followed by Edmonton Glengarry, Edmonton Meadowlark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My questions this afternoon are also to the Minister of Environment. On Thursday last, the Minister tabled 3 reports in this House. On the same day, the Calgary Herald, in a leading headline article, announced, and I quote, "The province should invest up to $4 billion draining important waterfowl wetlands." Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister, is the Minister planning major new drainage expenditures?
Well, Mr. Speaker, on the June the 9th, documents were tabled in this Assembly as a follow-up to recommendations made. Sorry. I can continue, Mr. Speaker? Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, on last Thursday, the 9th of June, I tabled in this Assembly 3 reports that were written as a follow-up to recommendations made by the Environment Council of Alberta to the Government of Alberta in December of 1984, asking that certain studies be undertaken to look at agricultural land use classification in the province of Alberta, and further that certain specific areas of improving or intensifying land usage in our province be undertaken. And on Thursday last, those reports were tabled. The reports are simply an inventory of options that are available in the long term, the 50-year to 100-year time frame from now, and there's absolutely no commitment on behalf of the government to undertake any of the 10 areas that was looked at, and there's certainly no anticipated expenditure of the kinds of dollars that was talked about by the Calgary Herald. Not only the Calgary Herald write a report, there was one in the Edmonton Sun on Sunday last, and both, I think, Mr. Speaker, are in the realm of Fantasyland cuckoo approaches.
The difficulty the Chair has is that our rules are established that we're not to confirm reports held in newspapers, nor while the Chair allowed the member for Stettler to read the headline, that was all that was read from one particular newspaper. It's better to ask the question than deal with the answer without dealing with these extraneous sources. Stettler, supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate your guidance. My apologies. Mr. Speaker, to carry on then, could the Minister elaborate, if that is not what the report said, what exactly did the report say, and what is his intention in acting on those recommendations?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the reports have been filed here in the Assembly. They're available to all members in the Assembly. They're very easy reports to read, and it's very, very clear. The preface was written by the Minister of the Environment, and it's open to anybody in this Assembly to read. If an honourable member wants me to comment with respect to a particular statement in the report, I'd be happy to do that, but it's not my understanding that that's the intent of the question period.
Mr. Speaker, then a specific question to the Minister. What initiatives is the Minister and his department undertaking specifically to improve and enhance waterfowl habitat?
Well, Mr. Speaker, number one, the reports in question will be circulated to literally hundreds and hundreds of organizations in the province of Alberta that have an interest in this whole particular matter. Number two, this government, through the Minister of Forestry, Public Lands and Wildlife, has for years been undertaking a very aggressive campaign to ensure that we upgrade our wetlands programs in the province of Alberta. Some of those initiatives are solely by the Minister of Forestry, Public Lands and Wildlife. Others are done in consort with the Minister of the Environment, the Minister of Agriculture. Ducks Unlimited has been a very, very major player in our province in terms of wetlands upgrading. There have been numerous examples of facilities that have been opened in recent years and in recent months, and only recently, in the last month, an agreement was reached with Ducks Unlimited and Cargill to ensure that, in fact, we were going to have another wetlands project commenced is using the effluent that would come out of the cargo plant in the High River area.
Final supplementary, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister of Agriculture. Will this minister assure the House that the government is not planning to announce a program to expand our agricultural land base by the 22 million acres suggested in the report?
Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to confirm what the Honourable Minister of Environment has indicated. It's a discussion paper. It's a long-range paper looking at the next 500 or the next 50 to 100 years. It's there for discussion purposes, and we look forward to input from interested groups.
Okay, the member for Edmonton Glengarry, followed by Calgary Buffalo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Considering the out-of-date nature of agricultural prices and other economic factors used in the report, could the minister guarantee that the report would never be acted upon until the economic predictions were redone in the light of existing agricultural conditions?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can do much better than that. In the letter that I penned to go with the report to all of the players in the province of Alberta, I have a very, very specific statement in there that not only are we going to be concerned about that, but we're also going to be ensuring that environmental impact mitigation and resource conservation initiatives will be a requirement before any approaches are taken with respect to the report in question.
Calgary Buffalo.
Yes, to the Minister of Forestry, Lands and Wildlife, with perhaps a supplementary information from the Minister of Agriculture. Wildlife habitat is presently disappearing at an alarming rate, and there's a need to reverse the process, and I'm wondering whether the government has in mind any initiatives which would encourage or provide incentives to farmers to maintain and indeed increase such habitat, specifically to farmers.
Mr. Speaker, that's a great question, because the answer is a very resounding yes. We have a number of programs through Buck for Wildlife and through the North American Waterfowl Management Plan, which will mean billions of dollars will be spent on habitat. And there's a booklet called Buck for Wildlife 1987 that enhances those significantly. We're also working with farmers as well in wetlands projects and trying in every way possible to create permanent bodies of water for wetland projects.
Edmonton Glengarry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So, some more great questions for the Minister of Forestry, Lands and Wildlife. Just as I'm sure this minister did, I breathed a sigh of relief when the Minister of Environment distanced himself from the appalling blueprint for wildlife destruction that he tabled last Thursday. Nonetheless, wildlife and wildlife management are in a sorry state in the province, as indicated by reductions in hunting and fishing opportunities enacted in the recent past. In view of his statement of in estimates debate, that is specifically, I'd like to emphasize, there has been no proposed reduction in the number of uniformed officers for 1988-89. I don't have enough of them. Everybody agrees with that. Is the minister committed to greatly increasing the number of wildlife enforcement officers in the very near future?
Mr. Speaker, I've never heard so much insinuation and innuendo that creates an insinuendo in all my life about things. We are working, wildlife in this province is not in a disastrous state. We're working on habitat improvement projects, and it's a high priority with our government. And as far as distancing ourselves from the report, we do reports on oil sands and coal and a wide variety of other things, and the opposition's always asking for reports and what studies have been done. This particular report makes no recommendations. It's simply a report that looks at a number of options, and we'll look at it at that basis along with a number of other reports. With respect to the third part of your question on enhancing or increasing the number of fish and wildlife officers in this province, that's a pitch I'll be making the provincial treasurer come fall.
Thank you. You'll have my support. Terry Gross, Assistant Regional Director of Law Enforcement for the United States Fish and Wildlife Department, publicly stated that organized poachers see Alberta as a patsy where enforcement is almost non-existent. Is the minister concerned that such a view is indeed well-founded and indicates that we do need many more enforcement officers?
Mr. Speaker, I don't know where that individual is supposed to have made that comment. He never made that comment in anything that I've been made aware of, and it certainly isn't a spot here that is a target. If we don't do our job well, it can be. We cannot possibly have enough enforcement officers, Mr. Speaker, in Alberta, and we need the public, and that's why we have the 1-800 hotline number. If you couldn't have enough officers to have them positioned in every position in this province, and that's where all the public, we ask them to call the 1-800 hotline number, and we'll investigate any of those. If there's anything like that, we always look at our policies with respect to making sure our wildlife is protected and enhanced, and we'll be here for generations to come.
Thank you. He made the statement at a public meeting in Edmonton to which the minister probably got the same invite I did. In view of the public's interest in wildlife, will the minister take the advice of Alberta Fish and Game Association and institute a task force on wildlife management in Alberta?
Mr. Speaker, I'm not considering that at the moment. There are a number of aspects in fish and wildlife management in Alberta that I'm working with the Fish and Game. One of the areas that I have had discussions with them recently that I think we can cooperate and come to some resolution on it is the poaching issue, and the poaching in Alberta for meat is one area that I think that we can work very closely on. There are a number of aspects, but to have a task force on a wide variety of issues, I don't feel that's necessary at this point in time.
Thank you. Will the minister at least concede that a task force on wildlife management would allow the public to give him some solutions to the many problems facing our wildlife resource before poor management and non-enforcement cause even greater problems?
Mr. Speaker, we have MLAs all across this province that hear on an ongoing basis from their constituents, as well as we have fish and game clubs and communities all across the province that receive that input. And any that input that comes to my office, I look at it very seriously and refer it on to the department. We are a proactive department and will continue to be that way.
Clover Bar, followed by Westlock Sturgeon.
Mr. Speaker, a supplementary question to the minister. Quite often, Mr. Speaker, we hear so-called sportsmen take 10 times their limit of fish, game birds, etc. My concern, Mr. Speaker, and my supplementary question to the minister is what steps is the government taking to encourage the Alberta Fish and Game Association to encourage the young and new hunters to understand that game laws are basically a moral issue that you cannot enforce. You cannot have an enforcement officer behind every tree or behind every pond. What is the government doing to encourage that organization through its young hunter training program to encourage young people to protect animals and game?
Mr. Speaker, it's making suggestions just like it is just made by the honourable member from Clover Bar that go a long way. The fish and game members in this province do have a responsibility to work with their hunter education and the recently released fishing education program and work on catch and release programs. And there's being far more awareness and use by non-consumptive users now. And I think the Fish and Game Association should also be working with them because our wildlife resource is one that we want to see continue. And each one of those clubs and each one of those individuals can play a very large role in seeing that happen.
Westlock Sturgeon, followed by Vermilion Viking.
Mr. Speaker, supplemental to the minister well knows the old case of allotting non-resident licenses and the control of fishing or of wildlife has been off again, on again, back and forth. Is the minister now prepared to commit to a date when he will come out with absolute clear non-resident licenses, because it is costing one of our great industries, the outfitters and guides, a lot of money because of the indecision of this government?
Mr. Speaker, I've been meeting on an ongoing basis over the course of the last since September with the outfitter guides and with the Fish and Game Associations and hunters across the province. We've come up with a process this year that seems very acceptable to the guides and outfitters as well as the Fish and Game, and using a trophy rule on elk and the allocation of hunting licenses. We have also recently instituted a new permit for hunters and outfitters and guides that will help them to bring some more order to their industry. So we are working with them on an ongoing basis, and we'll continue to do so.
Vermilion Viking.
Yes, supplemental to the minister, the native hunting rights that allow them access to hunting on a year-round basis in the province puts a lot of undue pressure on animal management. Is the department or minister looking at anything which may help to control some of the native hunting rights in certain areas at certain times of the year?
Mr. Speaker, over the course of years, it's been the traditional rights of natives to hunt for food for their family, and no one is saying anything about that particularly. There are areas, not only with natives but non-natives in the poaching area for meat, that are being significantly abused and I think need to be tackled. And that's where we come back to the member for Clover Bar's suggestion and recommendation, as well as my own to the Fishing Game Clubs, is that we all, including the Fishing Game Clubs and the Indian Association of Alberta, all of us need to look very seriously at that issue and recognize that we can do all of the wonderful things with our hunting regulations that we like. But if we allow illegal or poaching to take place, we defeat the purpose in the long term.
Edmonton Meadowlark, followed by Calgary Mountain Dew.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in spite of himself, the Premier in his statements last week implicitly recognized that our society and his government places a diminished value on much of what women choose to do. It is true that we undervalue the contribution of women who choose to work in the home. We also place we also diminish the economic value of much of the work of those women who choose to pursue careers outside the home. To the minister responsible for the status of women, has the Women's Advisory Council ever provided the minister with a documented list of gender-based pay inequities in her own government's public service?
No, Mr. Speaker.
Is the minister aware that the Red Deer Public Health Unit, 99% funded by this government, pays public health nurses requiring a 4-year BSc university degree no more than public health inspectors, all of whom are male and all of whom require only a 2-year diploma?
I was not aware of that specific instance, Mr. Speaker, but I'm interested to hear it. I would also say at this time that it is information, suggestions, opinions, and concerns that we wish to hear from men and women in Alberta when we launch our Alberta Dialogue on Economic Equity for Women. That Alberta Dialogue will speak to employers, both large and small, all around Alberta. One of the employers will be, of course, ourselves, and we intend to speak to civil servants at various levels in our own organization. That will, I'm sure, elicit many good ideas, although I would encourage all members of this House to bring forward good ideas.
Clearly, speaking to is one thing, doing specific analysis is another. Now that the minister is aware of the inequity in the public health unit in Red Deer, could the minister please tell us how she feels about that kind of inequity and whether she is prepared to take concrete action to do something about it?
The first question is out of order. You can't ask an opinion, but the second question is.
Mr. Speaker, I certainly will dialogue with the Minister for Community and Occupational Health on that issue.
The minister always avoids the issue of direct...
Thank you, member. It's inappropriate to comment on the answers. Let's have the supplementary. It's the final.
Why is it that this government, which consistently utilizes subsidies to promote certain things of economic and social value, such as job creation programs and economic development initiatives, as soon as it confronts the question of a gender in any of those formulae, conjures up a variety of self-serving arguments to justify not pursuing pay equity for women in the workforce?
Well, Mr. Speaker, let me say that we are searching for a Made in Alberta response to the indisputable fact that, taken on the average and overall, women are earning some 2/3 of what men are doing. But the causes are not simple, nor is there any one cause. Occupational segregation, as it is so often referred to, is probably the major cause, and we have taken admittedly long-range strategies and initiatives in that regard, but we've taken concrete steps. In fact, our program is called Stepping Stones, and we are speaking with junior high school students who are facing who are facing serious options at that stage in terms of their education, which will then lead them into a wider range of options for later occupations. That program will probably yield greater dividends over the long range than any other single initiative. Pay equity, even those who advocate it recognize that it only accounts for some 5% of the one-third disparity in wages. And yet, in Ontario, public funds, $4.3 million of public funds, are going directly to fund civil servants in their new jobs as pay police. We're not certain that Albertans are going to want to take that option.
Thank you. Evans and Avonmore, supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, to the Minister responsible for women, will she and her department undertake a systematic analysis of the employment practices and pay practices of both employers in the private sector and in the civil service to determine how representative the cases like that one cited by the member from Edmonton Meadowlark are? Certainly I have had cases where like that.
Mr. Speaker, we will take the matter under advisement.
Thank you. Stadler.
Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister of Community and Occupational Health. I wonder if he could confirm for the House that there are, in fact, despite what's happening in the Red Deer Health Unit, that there are, in fact, female public health inspectors in the province, and that they do enjoy equality of opportunity and pay in those positions.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, to the best of my knowledge, that is the case.
Thank you. Calgary Mountain View.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A week ago, the Assembly was told that a written proposal for a non-binding tribunal to resolve the Lubicon land claim had not been submitted to the federal government. For his part, Mr. Speaker, the federal Indian Affairs Minister appears to still be rejecting the tribunal proposal, apparently in the mistaken belief that it would be a binding one. I'd like to ask the Federal and Intergovernmental Affairs Minister if he could confirm for the Assembly that it was made clear to the Indian Affairs Minister that the tribunal would be non-binding, and is it that non-binding tribunal which the Indian Affairs Minister still appears to be rejecting?
They both raise the same problem.
Mr. Speaker, the discussions which took place between myself and the Federal Minister of Indian and Native Affairs covered the prospects of both a binding and non-binding tribunal. It would, of course, have been the preference of our government to have had the tribunal process binding, to have ended the matter once and for all. It was clear, however, that the federal government, and that was evidenced by the material that they released in written form when they indicated that they were prepared to have the matter dealt with in court. It was clear that the federal government found legal and other concerns with respect to a binding arbitration proposal. And therefore, subsequent discussions which took place canvassed the possibility of a non-binding process. That took place both in discussions between myself and between the two negotiators between the federal and provincial governments. With respect, I think I can answer the second question. The having rejected completely the concept of a binding arbitration process, the current proposal which is being rejected is the non-binding process.
Time for question period has expired. Might we have unanimous consent to complete this series of questions if they are not sub judice? Opposed, if any? Carried. Honourable member, but one question at a time instead of two, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Federal and Intergovernmental Affairs Minister, I'd just like him to confirm or clarify his last statement just as a bell was going. Has the Federal Indian Affairs Minister rejected the non-binding tribunal proposal put forward by the Premier?
At this particular stage, the question becomes more difficult to answer by reason of the fact that a legal process has commenced. Not only have statements of claim been issued, but the Chief Justice of the Court of Queen's Bench has started the process by which the matter will be resolved through the legal steps, and has indicated a timetable procedure which he is prepared personally to supervise. So it becomes difficult to answer the question without ranging into the field of where we are in the legal process. Nonetheless, I could say this, that the government of Alberta is still open to resolving the issue by settlement outside the necessity, or without the necessity, of pursuing the matter through to the final conclusion of a legal process, which might take a very long time.
Well, my understanding, Mr. Speaker, is that the legal process did not preclude negotiations being undertaken in the context of this tribunal. The Premier seemed to indicate earlier this month he had personally discussed a non-binding tribunal proposal with the Prime Minister. I'd like to ask the Premier whether since that time, or will he once again in the near future, personally approach the Prime Minister to convince him to agree to proceed with a non-binding tribunal as a way of reaching a negotiated settlement to this issue.
Mr. Speaker, now that the court case has started, I have to give a great deal of thought to ever trying to now get into negotiations again.
No.
Is the Premier saying to the legislature this afternoon that he feels that a negotiated settlement via a tribunal, non-binding tribunal process is no longer an option that he's willing to pursue at all in resolving this issue?
No, that's not what I said, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary, Calgary-Buffalo.
Attorney General, Mr. Speaker, one of the most important financial aspects of Mr. Fulton's report is his recommendation that the federal government compensate the province of Alberta for mineral rights transferred beyond the original 25.4 square miles. I'm wondering whether the minister will confirm that the federal government in fact refuses to agree to such compensation, and that the provincial government's support for an informal tribunal is partly based on a thought that we could get a better deal on that basis.
Mr. Speaker, that is clearly, if not marginally, completely over the line of the sub judice rule. But I think it is, so I'd be very reluctant to provide an answer at this stage without having carefully reviewed the exact wording that the Honourable Member for Buffalo just used, and I will try and respond if I can without offending the rule. The difficulty with the sub judice rule, as all honourable members knows, is that it's the responsibility to ask her the question, let alone the one trying to respond. And the chair surely can rely on the legal background of the member for Calgary-Buffalo and the Attorney General not to get us into this kind of a discourse. Is there a point of order arising from question period, Vegreville?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, though I realize you didn't rule any of my questions with regards to post office out of order this afternoon, it is an issue that I believe you've raised on every occasion that I've asked questions in this Assembly about what, if anything, this provincial government plans to do about the federal government's initiatives in that regard. And Beauchesne Section 359, subsection 6, that you've referred to on occasion, a question must be written within the administrative competence of the government. With respect, I recognize that a post office is a matter of federal responsibility. What I'm trying to seek is some willingness, some indication from this government that they're prepared to represent Albertans on that issue. Certainly the government of Saskatchewan allowing consideration and unanimous passage of a motion in that regard is significant. But I must admit, Mr. Speaker, I'm puzzled by your indication every time I try and ask questions on that matter that it's a federal issue and ought not to be dealt with here. I don't hear that same sort of interjection, if you will, being made when government members ask questions about payment of federal transportation subsidies to grain producers or producer cars or motions considered by the Assembly in regards to strategic arms limitation, if I might name a few. Certainly it's within the competence and jurisdiction of the Minister of Federal Intergovernmental Affairs to I can quote his act, shall conduct a continuing review of all policies, programs, and activities of the Government of Alberta and its agency in relation to the Government of Canada. And I submit that I'm doing what ought to be done and urging this government to do the same, Mr. Speaker, and I don't quite follow the logic of the questions being called to question because of the federal implications.
Thank you. The Chair recognizes the Attorney General. Mr. Speaker, the Honourable member keeps wanting us to deal with an issue which is clearly solely within the area of responsibility of the federal government. He has just now cited to you references to matters which are shared responsibilities, specifically agriculture, and another one specifically designated in section 94, I think it is, immigration. Those are clearly matters that are joint responsibilities, and agriculture has always been clearly a shared responsibility under the Constitution. Now, there are obviously occasions when the federal government consults with the province on matters that are within the area of responsibility of the federal government. And in those areas, it is clear that we do and have answered questions in the past. But where there has been no consultation or request for advice from the government of Alberta, to give it would be gratuitous advice. That's easy to do. But where there is a clear line of responsibility between the federal parliament and its members within Alberta and the people of Alberta, that's not within the competence of the Ministry of Federal and Intergovernmental Affairs to answer.
Thank you. Westlock Sturgeon, final person on this topic.
Speaker, if I may add in speaking to the point of order, is I think it's fairly common for the provincial government here to have legislation and plans in that wrap around or adjust for what the federal government is doing. For argument's sake, in field of transportation, the crow offset or crow benefit paid to people that have that are transferring feed to cattle. In other words, we moved in that area. The other area, in the case of bilingual education, is a grant that comes out there. Federal government has rules. The province tries to make rules around it. And so it's not unusual for the province to take something that the federal government may not be performing to the standards that they wish. We even have it sometimes in Medicare. And then for the province to enact rules or bonuses or incentives to bring better service to Albertans than the federal government is doing by itself.
Overbar.
Speaker, in all rules, reasonableness must persist. And the question the honourable member was asking, the government basically, what economic effect does it have? And therefore, Mr. Speaker, I can't understand if you use the rules of reasonableness, how that could be ruled out of order, because the shutting down of post offices do affect small communities. Therefore, that certainly is within our purview to ask a question such as that.
Well, the Chair appreciates the advice. Nevertheless, all honourable members, including the member raising the purported point of order, seems to have missed the point that all the questions were indeed allowed, and that it was the admonition was given at the end of the series of questions, and to which there had been not only questions but answers. And perhaps the honourable member might bear that in mind. The other thing is that, as pointed out with Beauchesne 359 subsection 6, that is indeed the relevant area to use as an authority.
but also as pointed out with some of the examples on transportation and the matter of interprovincial transport, which is a federal jurisdiction, but then as it interrelates with the grain industry, which is a provincial jurisdiction, you do have that kind of overlapping, which is indeed allowed. And the matter of the as raised is not on that list of 29 categories that are supposed to be exclusively or almost exclusively within the powers of Parliament. So does the chair hear some echoes in the place? That once again the chair would point out that the member was allowed to ask the questions, responses were given, and the chair just pointed out with due respect to the House that there are certain issues which the chair has difficulty with because they are supposedly part of a federal jurisdiction. Thank you for raising the matter of complaint and concern. Orders of the day. Might we revert briefly to the introduction of guests? Chair